storm of not only the great park, but the Indians, the Browns, the whole situation around that, how that came together, and really how important it was. Also, the loss of the Browns for that, but the town it truly, you call it.
Yeah, I've always I take a little exception to people always say, well, the Browns left. Well, guess what, folks? The Browns had nothing to do with the fact the Indians were selling out. They were selling out in '95, and the Browns were still very much in town. And while with the Browns leaving after the '95 season, more focus was on the Indians. Whether the Browns would have been here or not would never have impacted the Indians, because at that point it was all about the Indians, and the games were going to be sold out with or without the Browns. And I think what the Indians did was really fill a void much of the fall, because the Indians were always playing deep into October, and so I think if nothing else, the Indians helped fill a void there for the people that had lost the Browns.
I feel exactly what you're saying, and I agree. Not the financial impact, but perhaps that's why the love affair became that much deeper, because at the same time you have one guy who in most people's eyes is betraying the town. You've got this other story, and they just truly enveloped around that team and just took them in, and I agree with you there, because you're right. 95, the Browns were still here. That was the last season before everything went upside down. And I want to talk to you now. We're into that era now, talking about the 94, 95, 96, 97. By the way, why did you choose, I'm just curious, I know you've explained this in other interviews, why did you choose to focus specifically only up until 1997 in this book?
Well, that was really Terry's call, and I think part of it had to do with the fact that things were changing after the 95 season. The Indians obviously went to the World Series in 95 and 97, and while they would continue to dominate and go to the playoffs in 98, 99, and 2001, I think at some point, if you want to get into the details that Terry wanted to get into with some of the players and those special moments, you had to draw a line there. Otherwise, you'd have a book that would be the size of a Bible. And I think the other point of it was that period was really when so much of the core was still together. And little by little, that core was leaving. And so was kind of the general feeling of that very unique group that lost together in the early 90s and then was dominant together in the mid-90s. Carlos Baerga had been traded. Albert Bell walked away on free agent during the free agent period. Kenny Lofton had been traded, and so you had a number of the faces changing, and I think it's twofold. That's part of it. Plus, you didn't go back to the World Series after '97, and I think Terry's feeling was at some point to do the detail that he wanted to do on certain stories and players, that you had to kind of put it into a time frame. And let's face it, I think even though the Indians came within 3 outs of winning the World Series in '97, I think if you talk to Indians fans, the '95 season is the one they'll always remember, even though that club lost in 6 games to Atlanta. I think people remember that team and that year probably more so than any season in maybe the last 50 years of Indians baseball.
I'll tell you, funny you mentioned that. Yesterday, Mike Brandenberry from DidTheTryWinLastNight.com, him and I, our yesterday's show, we were, of course, the Browns quarterback deal this week, and he was like, you know what, J-Rock, I think the 95 Indians, they're more like Manziel. The 97 Indians, they're more like Hoyer. They're the blue collar, the hardware. The 95 has all the glitz and the glamour, and that was the team. And, that 95 team that you mentioned there, I mean, that 94 was the happy, it all kind of came together, and people were still getting used to having this park and this team and realizing what they could be. 95 was the year when Cleveland said, you know what, it's time to kick some sand in other people's faces instead of 40 years of having it done to us. And that team, that was a special team right there. Yesterday we mentioned it, even though they didn't finish the job. To me, I mean, I'm talking baseball history, I think 95 Indians go on the list of the all-time teams. I mean, I don't know where you put them, but that team was a fantastic team, even though some of the personalities led on the national level to it not being perhaps as feel-good of a story as it was for those of us here in Cleveland. Talk to me about the transition from 94 into that very special 95 season.
Well, I think we were the only market that wasn't impacted by the strike. As disappointing and as bitter as fans may have been to not see how far the Indians could take it in 94, Indians fans didn't remain bitter with the game of baseball like so many other people and communities did across America. And so they just couldn't wait for 95 to start whenever it was going to start. And, you know, the ball club and the fans kind of picked right up where they left off in August of 94. And so we were probably almost like Camelot compared to the rest of America when it came to the bitterness that the strike left with so many fans across America. We didn't have that here in Cleveland because people were just so gaga over their ball club and feeling like for the first time now in 40-some years, they had a chance to get to a World Series and to get to postseason. And so we were very fortunate that way, and the strike never did impact Cleveland like it did every other franchise. And so, you know, it was almost like we were living in a vacuum compared to everybody else. We were selling out. Other clubs were really struggling at the gate because of the fans' bitterness. And so it just took off. I mean, we late in spring training, Mike Hargrove and John Hart and Danny O'Dowd decided, let's give Jose Mesa a chance to be the closer. He couldn't get it done as a starter, and the Indians didn't really have a bona fide closer late in that shortened spring training, and that was a huge gamble. I mean, people look at it now, and Mesa had one of the great seasons in the history of closers, but nobody could have envisioned that prior to the season, and it was just kind of the way that whole year went. Everything the Indians tried worked, and they won 100 games in a 144-game season. 27 of those 100 wins were last at bat, and I think that all helped perpetuate this great feeling fans had about the ball club. They literally went to the ballpark expecting a win every night and pretty much always saw the Indians win. Some way, somehow, they found a way to win. And, you know, when 27% of your victories are last-at-bat victories, you'll never have a season like that again. And they were the most entertaining offensive ball club, not only in baseball, but one of the most entertaining offensive ball clubs in the history of the game. Plus, that club could really pitch. So there was not a weakness anywhere to be found. And, you know, it almost became the perfect season with the exception of losing the World Series.
When I talk to people about those teams, and especially 95, I say, there's a difference between hoping to win or even, probably thinking you're going to win and literally expecting to win. When you don't win, that's the aberration, and that was how strong that 95 team was. And let me ask you, I touched on it just a second ago, Albert Bell, the mercurial personality of Albert Bell. A lot of people, and I'm curious your thoughts being in the mix, how much of this is hindsight and how much of this was really going on at the time. A lot of people think that the Indians Super Bowl run, let's try that again as I'm looking at my Twitter feed here. The Indians World Series run with the Braves that year, that the national media kind of soured on what should have been the feel-good story of the Indians because of personalities like Albert Bell. Do you agree with that or no?
Oh, yeah, I think that was, pretty evident. Once you have a team get to the World Series, you're going to be covered like you've never been covered before, and you're going to have people covering your team that have never covered it before. And, obviously Albert Bell went off on Hannah Storm prior to a ball game, and she was a national network personality, and because you did it in the way he did it against a female, that obviously didn't look good. But in all honesty, I don't think anybody here in Cleveland gave a hoot what the national media thought, and they were tired of really being a national punchline for late night comedians. If anybody needed a cheap laugh, they'd tell a joke about Cleveland. Well, that all changed because of the perception of the city of Cleveland changed due to the ballpark and due to that ball club. The Indians were no longer a laughing stock. They were no longer hapless. They no longer played in a dump off Lake Erie. You know, they played in one of the palaces of baseball. They had the best team in baseball, and the city downtown was reinventing itself, and I think the national perception changed on Cleveland, and I don't think fans here really cared what anybody thought about Albert Bell as long as he was wearing an Indians uniform and hitting 50 home runs. They didn't care. He was their guy, and the national perception of the ball club might have been a little negative, but really at the end of the day, who cares? You know, this was a ball club that entertained the people of Cleveland and Northeast Ohio, and, you know, if other people around the country didn't like it, again, who cares?
Entertain is the word. It was the one era, and I know Hammy was on the radio calling it, but it didn't matter because you didn't need to listen to the game, watch the game, or anything to know if the Indians won. All you had to do was listen for the horns out the window anywhere around town every night throughout that season. It was just, it was magical. It was special. I ask guys this a lot, Tom. You were in there, and you may know how much closer some of these things came to happening or not. Indians on the verge. You know, you've got 2 runs at the World Series there in that period that we're talking about. Was there the one move that they didn't make or anything in your thought that would have put any of those teams over the top that they were close to, or boy, I really wish they would have been able to do this that would have finished off what they were trying to accomplish there?
Well, I mean, you can always look at a lot of woulda, coulda, shouldas. You know, they tried desperately to get Curt Schilling from the Philadelphia Phillies, and I thought, and I think the Indians thought it was going to be a done deal. And, you know, I think that obviously would have put the team over the top, and then Curt Schilling said no, that he didn't want the trade. And so, you know, who knows how that would have turned out, but I think it's been proven that Curt Schilling became one of the great postseason pitchers ever in baseball, and you know, I think without question that would have meant a difference for Cleveland and probably would have resulted in a World Series championship. You know, they looked very hard at making trades for Randy Johnson or even signing him as a free agent. And back then in those days, there were questions how long he would last because he had a bad back. And, you know, so I think there are some of those that in hindsight, you know, you wished you would have been able to make the deal. But, you know, I think sometimes there are second thoughts, you know, when they had a chance at free agency. They signed Jack McDowell, not Kevin Brown. But at the time, you know, Jack McDowell was a bigger winner than was Kevin Brown. Kevin Brown had some baggage that came with him, and he hadn't become the Kevin Brown we would later see, especially up close and personal, even though the Indians beat him twice in the 97 World Series. So you're always going to have that, you know, but I think, you know, what hurt the Indians in those days is, you know, they had a very good pitching staff, but when you got into October baseball, they sometimes were hurt by not having that one dominant guy.
Blackjack McDowell. See, I'm not going to hindsight it like some people will. I remember thinking that was a good deal. I thought, man, this guy, I like what he's done. I think this could fit right in. Turned out that it didn't, and that's why they play the games and they don't just draft him on paper. But I remember, a lot of people will look back at that now and hindsight it, but I remember thinking that was a good plug-in. But you're right, and that's why, you know what, looking to this Indians, you know, the current era, Jonathan Knight and I, one of our sports writers that we have on, we were talking about this a couple of weeks ago with Corey Kluber winning the Cy Young and Brantley finishing top 3 in the MVP, and we were going, man, even back in the 90s period, you'd probably have to go all the way back to the 40s or 50s to find an Indians team that had in both of those categories somebody, you know, in the 90s, you had a lot of people, Albert Bell, that you could have said were in the MVP conversation, but never a Cy Young candidate at the same time. And that's why I say, man, the window here is pretty good too, because those Indians that we think back and remember so fondly, they didn't have, you know, the combination of both. And perhaps, you know what, but do you agree? Can you think of an era other than going back to the, early days, going way back to the 40s and 50s of when the Indians had that combination in the same season, because none of those 90s teams, as you said, had that Cy Young caliber dominant starter.